This episode is brought to you by Instant Impact. Instant Impact provides transformative talent solutions to small and mid-sized companies that are making between 30 and 500 hires each year. If your recruitment's giving you a headache, don't know where to start, then give the team at Instant Impact a call or visit www.instant-impact.com for more information. I'm thrilled to welcome our next guest, Susan Steele, who is joining us after a storied career as a Chief People Officer in businesses ranging from mid-sized scale-ups to some of the best-known and most complex businesses in the world. Susan now holds a range of non-exec positions, which she'll tell you about shortly. But Susan, it's so good to have you on the show to discuss this really important topic.
Great. Hi, Felix. Great to be here. Shall I maybe just give you a quick overview about how my career has developed, and then we can jump into today's topic?
Took the words out of my mouth. Yes, please do.
Good. Okay. So I talk about my career in 3 phases. The first part was in financial services. I was in sales and marketing and compliance roles in some big financial institutions that are today part of JP Morgan Chase, HSBC and NASDAQ. And that was sort of how I felt my career would progress. But then I was recruited to move into recruitment. It happens.
Yeah, we do that.
And ended up with a very big part of my career focused initially on recruitment and then learning and development and then later HR leadership roles. And there I had the privilege to be in some very big iconic brands like Linklaters, WPP, Deloitte, and IBM. And I also then held Chief People Officer roles in some private equity-backed organizations like Ocean Technologies and Cision. So a wide range of roles there in the HR space. And then the third phase of my career, which is where I am now, is moving out of Chief People Officer roles into board roles, as you mentioned. So I have several board roles today. I am on the board of Open Classroom, the advisory board there, as well as chairing an interesting edtech business called Filtered. And I'm a venture partner at Emerge. We invest in workplace technology businesses. And I also find time, which I feel is very important, to help with some not-for-profit boards as well. So I'm on the board of the Reckoning Project, London Academy Trust, and a few other educational organizations as well. So that's a bit about me.
Absolutely. So in your spare time now,
Yeah.
And I think for anyone listening, Susan and I were talking about the Reckoning Project before. If you've got a spare 10 minutes, check them out. It's such an important organisation in today's very challenging geopolitical landscape, and they retrain local journalists to properly document evidence in the course of their journalism that can be used, if needed, in courts, taking war criminals and bringing them to justice.
Thank you. Yeah, so very important work.
Check that out. It's really, if we don't get time to go into it today, I just wanted to make sure that everyone took that action away to check that one out. So, Susan, we are in a world where the people agenda is top of mind. Not that it ever hasn't been, but it feels like it's getting more and more complex. It's keeping more boards up, more CEOs up at night, maybe than any other question, potentially with the exception of some of those geopolitical risks we were talking about just now with the Reckoning Project. You'd think then that the Chief People Officers are joining boards in droves, providing that really important people lens, right?
Well, yes and no. So let's take the first part of what you said there, Felix, which is people issues are top of the board agenda. We see that is very much the case. So whether it's succession planning, employee engagement, skill development, DEI, even ESG has a big people component to it, often with the S, the social piece. And in fact, boards report that they are spending more time these days, or they're improving their focus on culture over other things like financial performance and even cyber risk. So these items are moving up the board agenda. And in fact, CEOs report that people and culture issues are having the biggest impact on financial performance, or certainly in the top three things that are impacting financial performance. So this isn't going away. So to your point, you might think that that means boards are now actively seeking people with talent, with people with HR experience to join boards. But what we're seeing is that's not the case at all. In fact, I did some research ahead of today's discussion, and I found some fairly shocking information. For example, in a study that looked at board recruits over the last 5 years across boards in the US, UK, and Europe, 2% had HR experience. 2%,
Unbelievable.
which is tiny. Now, in the UK, it's a little bit better. Another study looked at FTSE 350 boards, and approximately 25% of those have people with some HR background and experience. But still, that means 75% have no HR or talent expertise, human capital expertise on the board, which is worrying. And then, if I could add one more stat, which was equally shocking, is that when it comes to companies that have remuneration committees, it turns out that very few of those, less than a quarter, are putting in RemCom chairs who have HR and executive compensation experience. So what that means is they're appointing sort of generalists who are having to learn on the job, presumably either through the chief people officer, ironically, or through third-party consultants. So it's just surprising with the increased focus on these areas that boards are not yet grasping the value that chief people officers and other HR leaders can bring to the board.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and it's really shocking stats. So let's put a pin in the fact that we want more chief people officers and CHROs to go onto boards. We'll come back to that with gusto in a little bit. But why do you think it is then? And I'm not sure whether any of these studies spoke to this, but why do you think it is that people leaders are not being appointed to boards and the remuneration committee thing just batshit crazy to me. Let's talk about boards first. Why is it that you think they're not getting appointed?
Well, let's take a step back and look at what most board roles require and what most boards are looking for. So usually top of the list is P&L experience. So that often leads boards to appoint either former or current CEOs and CFOs. Now, we can talk in a minute about how I think chief people officers have a lot of P&L experience, but it maybe isn't packaged that way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they're looking for previous board experience. Makes sense. You don't want to bring somebody onto a board who's never been on a board before. You don't want to be the place where they're having to learn the ropes. So I think that makes sense as well. Thirdly, you often find sector knowledge, sector experience is important, which I fully understand. Working with a lot of tech startups, I think it'd be very hard to have board members who didn't have SaaS experience, for example. If you're in pharma, you want somebody with pharma experience. And we can talk about how CPOs position their experience with that. But I think and often then you have another area, which is maybe very specific skills around things that are important to the company at that point in time. International expansion, M&A, digital transformation. So there could be some very specific things that are needed for that board member. But I think the biggest surprise here, and maybe I shouldn't be so surprised, is that still a very large percentage of board roles are filled through personal contacts, professional contacts, through networking, not going to search, not going to recruiters. So what it means is this sort of matchmaking is happening a little bit off stage. And CPOs and other HR leaders maybe just aren't even part of that network and just aren't being aware of those opportunities.
It's really interesting. And so I guess just to be really reductive, I like to be as reductive as possible. We've got one question which is around expectation and I suppose the perceived profile of someone that would constitute a good board member. I'd love to come back to that in the future. And then we've got network, which is obviously
always important.
Always important. Yeah. I'd add one more thing onto what you're saying, which is in my research for this, you know, I had a look at non-exec roles that you can apply to online on job boards. There are so few.
Yeah.
I mean, vanishingly few. Yeah. So I looked at, this was a couple of weeks ago there now, but I looked at non-exec roles on LinkedIn in London. We're talking like, I think it was 3 or 5.
Yeah. And how many of those required CFOs?
Well, quite. But I think that's really, I think it's a fascinating challenge because I think for any other position, you really have an expectation to open up that position much wider.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's dig into the profile of a non-exec because I think a lot of the things you spoke about are really, really interesting. When they come from a CEO or CFO perspective, there's that requirement to have the industry knowledge and the P&L experience. I think that's all fascinating from a position of, you know, we are a board looking to bring someone else on. But I wonder for those people that have less experience around boards, what do they expect of a non-exec? What's the actual role?
So a non-exec role is ultimately somebody who is curious, who asks good questions, who is not in an executive position. They're not the doers. They're more the askers. They're the ones expressing interest, curiosity, challenge to the executive team. And I see sometimes it's hard for people who've always been in executive roles and may still be in an executive role as a chief people officer or another member of the C-suite to step back from that doing role and be more of an advisor. And so that is the first thing, is that you have to take off your sort of executive hat and put on your non-exec hat. And secondly, I think recognizing that it's a team sport. You know, the board itself has to be effective. You have a role to play. There's been a lot of research done on the different roles within a board. You know, not only the facilitator, but the challenger, the external perspective, the internal perspective, and a number of other roles. So remember to sort of play a part and maybe change hats with that as well. And then I think ultimately it's about relationships. You need to get to know the people on your board as well as the executives in the organization as well. They're all people. They're all trying to do their best. And the board isn't just some faceless organization, but is a key part of any businesses or not-for-profit success.
So it's really interesting. So boards, like any other team in the organization, they have to be high-performing. I think for this question then, do you tend to have on board people bringing particular experience sets within the industry, within the organization? So for us, do you tend to have someone who is an ex-CTO, so can advise on the technology, someone that's an ex-chief people officer? So is that a useful facet to a board?
It depends. I think it really depends on the chair's perspective. In my experience, having boards that have both, well, let's say the T skills, so deep in some areas and broad in others, probably makes for the best mix. And so the beauty of that is that most HR leaders, most chief people officers have just that. You know, they'll have domain expertise, whether it's in executive comp or learning or retention, but then they'll often go broader than that. Because if you think about it, in an organization, most issues have at their heart people. So whether you're manufacturing or whether you're in professional services or, I don't know, B2C, there's people involved, and that is the domain of the chief people officer. And this is where I think sometimes CPOs sort of undersell themselves, because there's hardly a point in the organization's revenues or costs that are not somehow influenced by the chief people officer, arguably even more so than the CFO. So I think sometimes we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice by not stepping up and helping boards understand that a chief people officer role these days is really front and center to an organization's performance.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of, maybe a little bit of the subtext of what you're saying is quite a lot of this is in two things. So first of all, understanding what chief people officers, I guess, what their value, themselves realizing what value they have within their role. And then the second one being reframing. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit around how would you, let's say you're mentoring a chief people officer that's looking to make this journey, how can you help them reframe for themselves and externally the experience that they already have?
So I think the first thing is to put to one side your job title and your day-to-day responsibilities and think more broadly. Think like a board member, or think like the person on the board doing the interviews might be thinking. And so P&L experience, for example. So most chief people officers are managing very large budgets. And even if they're not managing the entire operating cost of an organization, they're influencing things like compensation, office costs, tech decisions. There's a whole range of things in addition to their own HR budgets that they're responsible for. And, you can put some big numbers there. Most chief people officers are controlling a very big chunk of the budget. On the revenue side, I don't know a single organization that's driving revenue without people, right? So CPOs are involved on the revenue side. They're making sure that sales teams can have the right skills, the right people, the right resources, that they're not being blocked in terms of being able to sell and drive revenue. And many chief people officers actually earlier in their career had sales experience. I mean, a very common path into HR, as you know, is through recruiting. Now, if you're in a recruiting firm, as you know, you got to drive some revenue, right? You're a fee earner. You have to sell business, win business, deliver business. You're on the revenue side. That's what you do. And so I think if most HR leaders could look back on some of their earlier experience, they might well see, oh yeah, I have been in sales. And sort of then tell that story about, yeah, I've been driving revenue, I've been managing costs, I understand how to bring that together. So I think nip that no P&L experience myth in the bud for a start.
Yeah, and if I may, I often think that there's a very easy final step that a lot of chief people officers miss when speaking about a new, a change to the remuneration structure or a change to like something that would impact culture, which is they'll often say, well, this is what we'll do, we'll get more engagement, we'll get more buy-in, we'll get lower retention, we'll get all of this. And stop the business case there often without saying, and that will drive revenue.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just sitting down with someone in the finance team and saying, hey, you know what? I just really like to convert this project into the impact it's going to have on cost and revenue. It's a half-hour meeting in a lot of cases. And just that little bit translates everything.
Indeed. That's a really good point. I think the other thing we touched on a bit earlier, but is really important, is get some board experience. Like you wouldn't expect to go catapulting into a chief people officer role without any HR experience. So I don't think people can realistically expect to go onto boards with no board experience. Now, the good news is it's really easy to get board experience because although perhaps not many roles are on LinkedIn, look further afield and you'll find tons of them. Every not-for-profit, every school, every religious organization is out there desperate for people to join their boards. get some experience. It doesn't matter, because very often what's important in boards is the governance experience, is just the experience of being in a board, making decisions. It doesn't have to be on the board of, a FTSE 100 straight out of the gate, but get that experience. And I would say start now. Don't leave it until much later in your career when you want to show, the board experience you've had. It'll be maybe not too late, but you want to show a track record of board experience over the years. So don't be afraid to start in a smallish not-for-profit. Devote the time to that. Get some good, again, to your point, get some good results. Track your performance there. And I know that will definitely pay off.
It's so, it's so interesting, because something clicked into my head when you were speaking. I mean, so many of these, I think we always have to deal with the sort of looming shadow of imposter syndrome, right? And I think a lot of people will be listening, like, yeah, well, what am I going to add to it? Like, let's say you've got an HR manager who's listening, hello, who's thinking, what am I going to add to a not-for-profit? I don't know anything about charity. The thing is, there's so many of these businesses. Let's take a theatre, for example. What's number one on their agenda a lot of the time? How are we going to bring in more younger audience members? How are we going to keep our staff? How are we going to do X, Y, and Z? All of these things are, as you say, a lot of boards are looking for people with different perspectives. People, they love bringing people in from commercial backgrounds who can provide a little bit more of that sort of commercial business rigor to the way that they run. So there will be a board out there that you can add loads of value to.
Exactly. And then I think, in terms of the sector experience we mentioned, yes, in an ideal world, that's a, round peg, round hole. And I would say that most HR leaders are very used to changing sectors, because that skill set transfers. And that actually is good news, because on every CPO's board profile, they should be mentioning that they have that agility to quickly learn new businesses, new sectors. So it doesn't matter that I haven't spent 100 years in pharma, but I've demonstrated I've been in 5 different sectors and I can learn pharma, for example. And so I think, again, when you're looking for these board roles, don't be afraid to call out that learning agility that served you well throughout a career, even if you don't have the sector experience.
Now let's get into this topic around network, because I think it's really important. Yeah. So this feels like a very difficult thing to unpick. So let's say at least 85% of roles, and let's say that things have changed nicely in the next couple of years, right? So in 2 years, we got 20% of roles that are going out to search agencies and being advertised online. So
it's still 80%.
There's still 80% that aren't.
Yeah.
So networks aren't built overnight. What can we all be doing to make ourselves front of mind when that private equity business is looking for a new board member to parachute in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, you have to hang out with different people. I love hanging out with HR people. They're great. And I learn things. I develop, professional friendships, personal friendships, what's not to like. And at the same time, you have to go and spend time elsewhere. Hang out with the investors in your sector or a sector you're interested in. Hang out with the private equity firms, the VC firms that are investing in these spaces. Hang out with, people who are looking at board effectiveness, for example. Hang out with company secretaries, for example. They're very well connected. But mix it up and start going to events, lectures, networking events that are outside your normal habitat of HR, and start to build up connections. And like anything, it takes time, but you'll soon see it snowball. So I think those efforts will quickly pay off, and before you know it, you're going to be the one that gets the call. Maybe not for yourself, but certainly you'll start to get the queries about, do you know anybody who could do X? And that's really what you want. You want to be in the flow, but you can't be in the flow if these people don't even know who you are.
Yeah, and as a little bit of advice from a recruiter to someone getting a call like that, it's often an English way of asking if you're interested in that.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I should say as well, when I say network, that could also mean social networks, social media. So start to think about what you're posting online, the posts you're responding to in terms of LinkedIn, the sort of thought leadership you're putting out there. And I think, gradually start to pivot that as well. You can't just be HR for HR. As fun as that is.
No, it's really important. And, you were talking about some of the things you're expected to do as a board member. Making connections is one of those things.
Yeah.
You want to be the person who you're having an issue with compliance or, whatever.
Yeah.
You say, well, you know what? I know someone really good for
Exactly. Yeah.
So to be that catalyst for easy conversations is just super, super important.
Well, and to your point, you're going to have a different network, but a chief people officer having a very different network to a CFO, for example. So don't underestimate the value of the network you're building.
I'd love to just spend a little bit of time talking about how this third phase of your career feels. Are you enjoying? What's it like?
So I stepped out of being a full-time chief people officer primarily because I was starting to get momentum with my board roles and felt that I could not do both justice, both the board roles as well as being a full-time CPO. And that part I don't regret. What I'm finding is that having many different roles, many board roles, and I'm also advising a number of founders, is very interesting. No day is the same. It's full of variety, which I love. And that in itself is a little bit more tiring than having one role that you do every day. And as demanding as a CPO role can be, you sort of know what's happening and what's likely to come your way. Whereas advising a number of founders, being on different boards, going through different phases of the business, there's more variety, but there's also a little bit more uncertainty. And so it's fun, but it also, I think, takes a bit more energy. So I'm enjoying it a lot, and I'm not finding it quite as restful as I guess I thought when I was in a full-time CPO role. But it's lots of fun, and I thoroughly recommend it as a next stage for any HR leader who has an interest in helping boards.
Yeah, and I suppose just the amount, I guess you never come up against a call or a meeting where you don't have to really engage your grey matter. I would imagine that that when you're brought in to advise on something, it's it's complex, it's hard, and you're not able to sort of copy and paste something that you've done
exactly,
so much, right? Exactly.
Yeah, just getting ready for board meetings and for all the work that happens outside board meetings, and there's a lot of that. Is very demanding. You can't just sleepwalk into these roles by any means.
That's really, really interesting. I'd love to get your reflection on, do you think that you've discovered a part of your knowledge base that you picked up as a chief people officer that has served you well as a non-exec that maybe was a little surprising to you?
Well, I think that one of the things that I am finding that translates easily and where there's a need for it is in working with first-time CEOs. Now, as a chief people officer, I've worked with a number of first-time chief executives. That's been rewarding, frustrating, interesting, all of the above, but generally very, very satisfying. And on boards, you have the same thing. A lot of businesses are run these days by, and especially founder businesses, first-time CEOs. So you need to be able to draw on that experience. But as I said earlier, not by telling the CEO what to do, but by coaching, guiding, being curious, respectfully challenging. So I think that's certainly one CPO skill set that is still very much needed in the boardroom.
That's really, really interesting. Susan, I've loved our conversation today.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. And you know what I really particularly like about it is how I love it when I finish an episode, and I think people listening to this will find this really, really helpful. So thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. And just in conclusion, I'd like to say that amongst people listening to this podcast, if you find yourself, looking to make this sort of move or just want a sounding board, reach out to me. I'm very happy to help. I think more of us who are in that very small percentage of HR leaders on boards need to help the next gen. So very happy to help in whatever way I can.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.